Here's some quick figure studies in ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and white in acrylic. So I pre-mixed colors for these, which I'll show you later. And I think you'll find this palette really useful. They're all the most inexpensive colors, and you can get really good flesh tones out of them. It's a good way to really keep a very simple palette and still have a full range of color. The ground I'm using is Neutral Gray number 6 by Golden. So I got this palette from this painter. This is Eugene Delacroix. This is King Sardanapalus. This is in the Louvre. I know that also John Singer Sargent used it. This painting's in the Corcoran. Sargent's more well known for his portraits, and he definitely knew about flesh tones. And he used it sometimes to start things out in oil, but also he would use it with water-based media. So here's a watercolor of his. It's a pretty similar, basically like two-color complement palette, like a brown and a bluish color. So I think you'll like this palette. It's very useful. Let's take a look. Here I've got a Stay Wet palette, and in it I have the palette we're going to use to mix some flesh tones, which is just ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and titanium white. You can't see the word titanium here, but it's there. So these colors are really good because they balance each other. They make very good neutrals. And this Stay Wet palette paper isn't great to mix on if I'm going to use a palette knife. And I want to have a few colors mixed up because that makes things go much more quickly. So I'm going to just grab some. And so since I have my color notes here, I changed this dirtier palette, and I'm going to mix with the same, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and white. I'm going to start by mixing a warm and cool mixed black with just the ultramarine and burnt sienna, and then look at my color notes, and I know that each of these has a little bit of everything else in it, except the very lightest highlight has only the white and the burnt sienna. So I put the white on the ultramarine blue side because they're both cold colors, and you'll see what I mean as I'm mixing the colors. So this Stay Wet palette needs to stay a little flatter, otherwise the stuff will slide down, and I'm going to mix on the lid because it gives me a harder surface to mix with a palette knife. And I'm just going to match these colors I have here from my color notes. Here's a little closer look at my color notes in the sketchbook, right, dark to light. So here I'm mixing the colors, starting with the darkest darks, the pure ultramarine burnt sienna, no white in them. Everything else will have a little bit of white in it, and just working my way up through roughly matching the color notes I had. And again, I like the plastic lid because it's easier to mix on, and sometimes if I have a color about the right value, it's easier to nudge it a little warm and cool, because those midtones, really the temperature varies a lot. So then I'll start to come up into the light and highlight color, and then I'm ready to go. And you may notice that highlight color is only the burnt sienna and white. And I started with the white and added a little sienna to it. Otherwise it stays too cold because white's a cold color. Having these colors mixed up beforehand makes it go so much quicker if you're trying to do more rapid, shorter studies like these. So I'll start with like a dark mid-tone, map everything out, head, rib cage, pelvis, the spine, tying them together where the weight is, set in the shadows, and work my way up to the lights. And I'm using generally like as large of a brush as I can handle to get these areas laid in pretty quickly. Delacroix, who I got the palette from, said to start with a broom and finish with a needle. And you'll notice that I'm using fairly large brushes for the planes I'm making with the brush. So it's a useful palette and really simple way to balance the warms and cools, and you get pretty good flesh tones from it across a variety of values and colors of skin tone. So here's those studies at the end, and I want to go ahead and build up a little bit longer drawing with a model with a little bit darker skin. So starting the same way, mapping it out with a dark, getting the gesture right, checking some proportion, and then working my way up from the darks to the lights. So the light below the highlight is warmer on this model, and I've added a little bit. I've added like one extra value in, but it's still mixed with the same colors, so it's easy to figure out how to mix things. Here are the brushes I'm using for this too. So I got a large round I start sketching things out with, and then all filberts, a few sizes of filbert, and then one small round for detail when I get to it. So I'll show you this drawing start to finish, and I'm using the same piece of paper for the drawing, and the palette. That way you can see everything close together and see how I build up the colors from this limited palette. Again, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, a little bit of the N6, and then titanium white. So also, since I'm not using a stay wet palette or anything, I'm just doing this all on the same paper so that the palette and the drawing are on the same on screen at the same time, I'm just going to mist it with some water just to keep the acrylic from drying out. So we have our priority action first, then proportion, then volume, then detail. I'm just going to mix the pure ultramarine burnt sienna with no white in it to start mapping things out, getting the gesture right. Acrylic changes wet to dry, so I'm going to take a little square of that N6 that I painted the ground with, and you'll see pretty quickly it dries down to exactly the same value as the ground. That's a good thing to remember, because you don't want your darks to get too dark. Like a dark you put on at the start and you think it's good, when it dries down and it darkens, might look like a hole in the model. So be careful about your darks. So I'm just going to start lightly getting the gesture down, and remember, you're better off neurologically taking an estimate and then verifying it. So I'm just building up logically what I see, looking for kind of a line of action, head, rib cage, pelvis, looking for the axis of the shoulders, axis of the pelvis, down the weight-bearing leg, and then the other leg, and back up to the arms. Now this model has a pole that they're supporting themselves partly with, so I'm going to want to include that since it affects the weight. Now once I get everything there and get the gesture there, I'm going to check proportion, and you can do that actually if you have a palette knife. It's kind of handy with this technique. You'll see in a second what I'll do is I'll take the palette knife and I'll mark off a head height on it, right? And then I can count head heights down to check my proportion, right? So I'll count off head heights so I can then look at my reference and see how my proportion is looking. When we check proportion, it's also a really good time to check balance. And this is a really important part of the drawing. It doesn't look like much yet. I'm not that involved with anything, so I'm not going to be hesitant to change what I need to change. So I can also check the balance of the model and erase things with my ground color. You see how that square I put down that was lighter is now exactly the same as the ground. So if I'm a little wrong about things, it's great to be able to erase with something that's going to dry down to just what the paper looks like. So now I'm checking my proportion and it's looking okay. That's the pit of the neck or your suprasternal notch. So if I check making an imaginary line down to the ground to see how my balance is, right? Just before I get too involved, if it starts looking like skin, I'm not going to want to change it. So now I'm just laying in and correcting things, and I'm starting with a dark, right? No white in it yet. I want to make a map of everything and then slowly build my way up. Now you'll notice as I correct, I can go over these lines where I had like the pelvis axis. I can go over that with the ground color if I want to get rid of it. So as I start to lighten up, it looks like I added a little too much white, so I'll darken it down with some blue, test it out. I just wanted to mix as I went for you as well for this demonstration. So once I get a reasonable shadow color, I'm just going to go ahead and lay it in everywhere. As this goes on, you'll notice I'll warm up some shadows, leave others more cool. Rough rule of thumb, if you have a single figure, shadows are going to be warmer where they face into lit skin, so I'll use more burnt sienna there and use more of the ultramarine where the model faces out into where the shadows face out into the kind of ambient gray of their surround. So now I'm really, by addressing volume, I'm trying to get the plane break in. So I'm putting in all the shadows at once on the model, trying to work in all the shadows and basically mix my way from dark up to light. So as I do this, I'm checking proportion and noticing little things that need to be fixed and trying to fix them. I'm squirting the palette, and this palette's at a little bit of an angle, so you'll see later on it'll start to drip a little bit. See, I can erase the contour, the extra lines or where the edges carry over, and clean things up. Now I'll go a lot faster, put the pole in, start building up from darkest darks up to the lightest lights. I haven't really put anything in on the light side of the plane brake. She's got pretty strong reflected light, so I'll add a little bit of that in. And then slowly work my way up to the highlight eventually. Now, one of the things about paint is it's a little bit warmer over a light color, so it's okay to lighten up your lights a little bit extra at the beginning, because you can always darken them back down. So really, I'm just trying to get the volumes right and continue to adjust the proportion most of the time. I haven't really gone into too much detail. I haven't used that small of a brush yet, because I really want to get the big things right and really try and get the colors balanced. And you can see you can get pretty good flesh tones out of this. It's a good, limited, inexpensive palette. So I just keep working things up with a smaller brush. Now I'm starting to get to some of the detail, trying to fix the tilt of her face and get the features a little bit better. Now coming back into some of the reflected lights. So I'm working my way down to a smaller brush there at the end, getting to some detail. Here it is at the end. And I find this a really useful, inexpensive palette, and I hope this was informative and that you'll enjoy this technique.